For nearly 200 years, Glasgow was infested with razor gangs. Open razors, flick knives, and broken bottles ruled certain streets, where a beating was the best possible outcome you can get. The real nightmare was their signature, a mouth carved from ear to ear, the infamous Glasgow smile. It turned faces into warnings and turned Glasgow's razor gangs into the most feared street crews in Britain. Let's take a look. It goes without saying that Glasgow did not wake up one morning and decide to become violent. The World Health Organization would later single out Scotland as one of the most violent nations in the Western world, and Glasgow as Europe's murder capital. But the foundations of that reputation were poured decades earlier in cramped closes, damp tenements, and overcrowded slums. By the 1920s and 1930s, the city had more gangs than anywhere else in Britain, with some estimates suggesting that there were 6 times more gangs in Glasgow than in London, despite London being vastly bigger. In the poorest districts, violence was not just an occasional outburst, it was part of how territory, respect, and survival were negotiated. The roots go back at least to the late 19th century. As soon as large working-class districts began to turn into slums, bands of young men formed loose groups that slowly hardened into organized street gangs. The earliest of these were known as penny mobs, named for the small levy members paid into a fund to cover fines when they inevitably ended up in court. That tiny payment said a lot. The expectation was not if they would clash with rivals or the police, but when. By the time the 20th century arrived, new gangs had adopted more colorful names and a more brutal style. Groups like the Redskins, whose members took pride in the red-tinged scars slashed across their faces, wore their injuries as proof of commitment. At the same time, Glasgow was changing in ways that made confrontation almost inevitable. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, large numbers of Irish immigrants, many of them Roman Catholic, arrived on the Clyde in search of work and survival, feeling the aftershocks of famine and poverty at home. They settled in districts like the Gorbals in the south, Calton in the east, and areas that would later be known as Royston, just north of the river. These were mostly Protestant areas, in a city rooted in a Protestant national identity, and the newcomers were often treated not as neighbours, but as a threat. Unemployment in interwar Glasgow was devastating. Between 1930 and 1935, the city's unemployment rate hovered between a quarter and a third of the workforce. It would be misleading to say that joblessness alone created the gangs, because they had existed before the worst of the economic collapse. But mass unemployment changed their shape. Young men in their 20s and even 30s with nowhere to work and little chance of escape remained active in street gangs that gave them structure, identity, and somewhere to put their frustration. For many, these groups became a substitute workplace, a social club, and a family rolled into one, with violence as an unofficial entrance fee. Territory became everything. Street gangs named themselves after the corners they guarded and the districts they patrolled. The Bridgeton Billy Boys, the Calton Entry, the Govan Team, the Sand Toy, and the Beehive Boys, the last named after a local draper's shop on a Gorbal street corner, all drew their strength from specific blocks of Glasgow that they claimed as their own. In those places, the police were not the unquestioned authority, they were rivals for control. Confrontations between officers and gangs could erupt simply because the police tried to arrest one man in the wrong close at the wrong time, and soon enough dozens, sometimes hundreds of local residents would spill into the street. The relationship between these gangs and the police in the 1920s and 1930s was confrontational on both sides. Glasgow's police kept a network of paid informers in pubs and backrooms across the south side and east end, trying to anticipate fights, marches, and ambushes. When officers moved to arrest gang members, clashes often escalated into running street battles. In one disturbance in 1939 in the Gorbals, members of 2 gangs joined forces against the police. Hundreds of locals gathered on corners, reinforcements had their cars stoned, windows were smashed, and officers ended up guarding shop fronts to prevent looting. This was not petty mischief. These were communities where the line between crowd and gang, between audience and participant, was thin. Alongside this territorial logic, another fault line cut through Glasgow: sectarianism. For centuries, religious division had simmered in Scotland, but in Glasgow, it took on a particularly sharp edge. The city's Protestant majority watched as Catholic Irish immigrants formed tight neighbourhoods, partly for safety, and partly because discrimination pushed them into certain areas and jobs, when jobs were available at all. Many Protestants saw these new arrivals as competition for scarce work and housing, even when Catholic workers themselves struggled to be hired. Prejudices hardened into the belief that Catholics were outsiders who threatened the local way of life, and the belief spilled out in the form of gangs that were not only territorial, but also religiously aligned. This is where some of Glasgow's most infamous names emerge. The Bridgeton Billy Boys, based in the East End district of Bridgeton, were a Protestant gang that openly identified themselves with loyalist politics and a sense of patriotic duty to defend what they saw as their community and their constitution. Their rivals, the Norman Conks, were a Catholic razor gang based nearby. The two groups gathered within walking distance of each other, one around Bridgeton Cross, the other in streets a short distance away. The geography practically guaranteed regular clashes. It was not just about who controlled which corner, it was about who controlled the story of who belonged in the city. The Billy Boys were led by Billy Fullerton, a man whose politics leaned towards the extreme right. He had been associated with British fascist movements and later aligned himself with the British Union of Fascists in the 1930s. Under his leadership, the gang borrowed heavily from military style. They marched in formation, wore similar clothing, formed their own flute bands and composed songs to announce their presence. They even created a junior wing, the Derry Boys, made up of teenagers who saw graduation into the main gang as a promotion. To their supporters, they looked like a disciplined army defending their patch. To their enemies and to the authorities, they looked like a private militia. It goes without saying that these theatrics were not harmless pageantry. When the Billy Boys marched, they did not simply parade through empty streets. They moved into or towards Catholic areas, including narrow streets like Norman Street, where Norman Conks lived, knowing full well that missiles, bottles, rubbish and worse would rain down from windows and rooftops and that confrontation would spill into the road. Each march was as much a provocation as a display of strength. Each clash reinforced a simple message: cross the invisible boundary at your own risk. Football added fuel to the fire. Glasgow's two big clubs, Rangers and Celtic, had become symbols around which sectarian identities rallied, with much of the west of the city supporting Rangers and large parts of the east backing Celtic. Derby days brought thousands of fans onto the same trains, platforms, and streets. For gangs like the Billy Boys, this was an opportunity. Members could blend into the wider crowd of Rangers supporters and then pick their moment to attack Catholic rivals under a cover of football rivalry, disguising sectarian assaults as ordinary hooliganism. One of the most notorious incidents took place in March 1934 at Bridgeton Cross Station. Hundreds of Rangers fans packed the platform on their way to a home game, blue scarves and rosettes everywhere. When a train carrying Celtic supporters to another match pulled in, abuse flew back and forth between the carriage windows and the platform edge. In the middle of that chaos, members of the Billy Boys saw their moment. A known gang member forced his way onto the train and attacked a Celtic supporter with a razor, aiming directly for the face. The victim raised his arm and took the slash there instead. Other passengers and staff struggled to push the attacker back onto the platform as the train pulled away. On paper, this was one assault among many in a city used to blades. In practice, the authorities read it as something far more dangerous. Here was a sectarian gang infiltrating a football crowd, turning thousands of ordinary supporters into accidental camouflage for a targeted attack. If that tactic spread, large crowds could be weaponized for political violence. The man responsible was arrested, identified, and brought to trial. Unlike earlier occasions when Protestant defendants had often been treated leniently, the judge in this case imposed a severe sentence of several years in prison. Thousands signed a petition complaining that it was excessive, but the punishment stood. It was a sign that tolerance for gang theatrics was over. The manhunt and trial coincided with the arrival of a new chief constable in Glasgow, Percy Sillitoe, already known for cracking down on gangs in Sheffield. He believed that the usual approach of arresting a few men and issuing fines was pointless. Fines were simply paid from gang funds, often collected through subscriptions like those penny mob levies. Instead, he set out to break the gang's confidence, disrupt their finances, and show, sometimes literally, that the police could hit back just as hard. He recruited large, physically imposing officers from rural areas and the Highlands, reinforcing the city force with a unit that locals would later call his shock troops. Under Sillitoe, The Glasgow police were often described as the biggest gang in the world. Mounted police units, plainclothes officers, and carefully timed ambushes replaced the more reactive policing of earlier years. In one famous operation, Sillito arranged for police to lie in wait near Celtic Park and the streets around Norman Street. They did not charge in at the first sign of trouble. Instead, they waited until rival groups had exhausted themselves in fighting and then swept down, batons flying, to arrest as many as possible. In another strategic move, he went after the Billy Boys' finances, seizing a substantial bank account that had been used to pay court costs, fines, and even clothing for members leaving prison. Without that financial backbone, maintaining the gang's structure became far harder. None of this meant that violence disappeared. It meant that certain kinds of grandstanding became riskier. Fullerton himself would eventually move from street leadership to involvement with openly fascist organizations and even a local branch of the Ku Klux Klan. His life ended in poverty in the early 1960s, in a small tenement room not far from the territory he once dominated, and he was buried in an unmarked grave. The funeral procession still drew hundreds of marchers and flute bands, a reminder that even as one man fell, the legend of the Billy Boys had seeped deep into Glasgow's memory. By the late 1960s, talk of razor gangs from the interwar years had given way to a new moral panic about youth gangs that were presented as younger, more chaotic, and more dangerous. Media and police attention focused on so-called young teams, groups of teenagers who claimed stairwells, housing schemes, and street corners as their turf. By the mid-2000s, Greater Glasgow had as many of these gangs as London, despite being far smaller in size. The weapons changed slightly, the clothing changed completely, but the core idea stayed the same. This is our patch, step over the line, and there will be consequences. What changed more slowly was the mindset around scars. In earlier decades, the Glasgow smile and other facial wounds were not just byproducts of violence, they were deliberate. Slashing a victim from the corner of the mouth towards the ear with a razor or twin blades mounted on a handle was a way to leave a permanent mark that everyone would recognize. Surgeons who treated these victims described how difficult such injuries were to repair. The central strip of tissue between two parallel cuts often had so little blood supply that it would die if they tried to sew it back into place, forcing them to remove it and pull the remaining skin together, leaving a wide and obvious scar. Doctors in Glasgow became accustomed to seeing young men with brutal facial injuries arriving at all hours. Some were ashamed, but others saw the scars as badges of honor that proved they had been in the thick of gang life. In some friendship groups, almost everyone had a mark somewhere. The Glasgow smile, sometimes done on both sides of the face to create a grotesque parody of a grin, was often inflicted when victims were held down. It was less about incapacitating someone in the moment and more about ensuring that every future encounter, job interview, or casual glance in a mirror would be shaped by that single act of violence. Even into the 2000s, sharp instrument assaults placed a heavy burden on Glasgow's hospitals. In a single year, around 2008 to 2009, thousands of bed days in the region were taken up by victims of blade attacks, the equivalent of several hospital beds being occupied continuously by people whose main injury was not illness or accident, but an encounter with a weapon. Behind those numbers were families trying to understand how an argument in a park, a chance meeting outside a pub, or a petty feud between neighbors could escalate so quickly that someone would not come home. One modern case in 2010 captured how little some dynamics had changed, even as the political landscape and city skyline evolved. In the Mary Hill area in the northwest of Glasgow, an already deprived district with multiple local gangs, a trivial insult set off a chain of events that ended in murder. A young man tampered with a bottle of cheap fortified wine belonging to another youth linked to a local family. It was not a criminal enterprise, not a high-level dispute about drugs or money, just a juvenile prank involving urine and a stolen drink. Yet in an environment where reputation, respect, and public embarrassment mattered intensely, this was treated as an unforgivable slight. Retaliation followed. The prankster was stabbed, and tension between the two families involved, the Currans and the Malvins, rose sharply. Older relatives recognized the danger of an escalating feud that could claim more lives. A meeting was arranged in Maryhill Park, in theory as a way to talk things through and prevent further bloodshed. Both sides agreed to come. On paper, it sounded like an attempt at de-escalation. In reality, one side arrived armed for war. Members of the Malvin side turned up with a shotgun, machetes, knives, and backup. When younger members of the Curran family and their friends came to the park expecting a heated but weapon-free confrontation, they instead faced an ambush. As trouble flared, Andrew Curran Sr., a man in his 40s and the father of one of the young men involved, ran from his nearby home to the park when he heard that his son was in danger. He was unarmed, relying on the hope that an older voice could calm things down. Instead, he became the focus of the attack. Witnesses later described him as being chased across the park by a younger man wielding a machete. He was cornered and slashed in the stomach and neck. His son watched as his father tried to hold his own throat, blood pouring through his fingers. A friend of the family, James McGregor, tried to intervene and was hunted down, slashed with a sword and shot with a crossbow. This was not some distant echo of 1930s street battles. It was happening in modern Glasgow, in a public park, over the kind of slight that would barely raise an eyebrow to most towns. Paramedics and doctors could not save Andrew Curran Sr. He died the same day. The community knew almost immediately who was responsible. In tight-knit areas like Mary Hill, word travels fast. People talk to each other, even when they are too frightened to talk to the police. Within hours, information about the attack and the suspects was circulating among residents and journalists. The challenge for the justice system was not identifying names, it was persuading witnesses to stand up in court despite the very real risk of violent retaliation. That risk was not theoretical. Within hours of convictions later being announced, windows were shot through with shotguns, people were slashed in the street, and threats were made against those thought to have cooperated with the authorities. Families who had never considered themselves part of gang life found themselves living with the consequences of gang codes, where talking to the police is considered betrayal. For many ordinary people in Glasgow's housing schemes, the idea of testifying is not just about civic duty, it is about whether they can safely walk out of their own front door the next morning. Despite that climate of fear, the case did make it to trial. 2 brothers from the Malvin family and an associate were convicted of murdering Andrew Curran and of seriously assaulting James McGregor. Lengthy prison sentences followed, yet the violence did not end at the courtroom door. Not long after the convictions, Andrew Curran's son was attacked and stabbed in the head with a machete near the spot where his father had been killed, a brutal reminder that vendettas can outlive any individual sentence. If all of this sounds like a city trapped in an endless loop, it is important to recognize that something else was happening in Glasgow at the same time. The cycle of enforcement, retaliation, and repeat offenders was becoming unsustainable, both morally and financially. A straightforward murder investigation could cost more than £1 million. Keeping one person in prison for a year ran into tens of thousands. At some point, a question had to be asked: was it enough to keep reacting, or did the city need to change the way it thought about violence altogether? That was the backdrop against which the Violence Reduction Unit was created in the mid-2000s. Based in Strathclyde and later influencing policy across Scotland, this unit took an approach that many people initially considered radical. Instead of treating violence purely as a criminal justice problem, they framed it as a public health issue, something contagious that could be understood, interrupted, and prevented. They set out not only to arrest knife carriers, but also to speak directly to gang members, families, and communities in an attempt to break the culture that kept producing the same tragedies. One of the most striking tactics involved bringing rival gang members into courtrooms, not in handcuffs, but as an audience. Dozens, sometimes more than 100 young men who were on police radar were invited and strongly encouraged to sit in front of judges, senior police officers, surgeons, and bereaved parents. The message was direct. Police made it clear that they knew who these men were and where they lived, and that they had the power to make their lives very difficult if the violence continued. At the same time, they offered a different path: support to get out, to find work, to move away from the constant expectation of carrying a weapon. Surgeons who regularly treated knife injuries showed graphic images of the damage blades did to faces, necks, and bodies. They explained in simple terms that the scars would not fade, that some victims would be disfigured for life, and that some would never walk out of hospital again. Mothers who had lost their sons to gang violence spoke about holding dying children in their arms and living every day with a grief that did not go away. In those moments, bravado drained from the room. Men who had strutted with chests out found it difficult to meet anyone's eyes. The crucial point was choice. Many of the young men in the room had never really been given one before. They had not chosen where to be born, which school to attend, or which gang dominated their area. In many cases, joining a group had been less a decision and more an expectation. Now, in front of the court, they were told openly that they had a different option: continue on the same path and face relentless enforcement, or step away and accept help to build another life. Some ignored the offer, but many did not. Over time, hundreds engaged with programs that steered them towards work, education, and away from daily confrontation. The impact of Glasgow's response reached beyond Scotland. Police forces and policymakers from other parts of the United Kingdom began to pay attention, visiting the city to see how a place once written off as incorrigibly violent was starting to bend its own trajectory. For years, Glasgow's razor gangs had been held up in books, headlines, and television dramas as the darkest example of urban brutality on British soil. Now, the same city was being studied for lessons on how to reduce knife crime, engage with communities, and treat violence as something that could be prevented rather than simply punished. The reputation that had once made Glasgow feared across the UK was being flipped on its head and turned into a cautionary tale and a blueprint at the same time. It also helped that the wider culture was changing. Social media made it easier for gruesome incidents to be filmed and shared instantly, but it also made it possible for counter-narratives to spread. Former gang members could speak directly to younger teenagers and show them the reality behind the bravado. Schools and youth projects could connect to locally rooted mentors with at-risk young people. Employers willing to take a chance on someone with a past could publicly talk about why they did it. Each of these threads was fragile on its own, but together they contributed to an atmosphere where walking away from trouble began to look slowly like the smarter choice. Today, Glasgow is still a city where history is written in scars, but the meaning of those scars is shifting. Younger people are more conscious of image, employment, and opportunity. A deep facial wound is increasingly seen not as a badge of honor, but as something that can close doors before they even open. Doctors, teachers, youth workers, and former gang members themselves reinforce the message that carrying a knife does not make someone powerful. It makes it far more likely that they will end up in hospital, prison, or a grave. The mentality that produced razor gangs and Glasgow smiles has taken more than a century to entrench itself, and no single policy or project will erase it overnight. Sectarian tensions still flare around football matches. Territorial rivalries still exist in housing schemes. There are still families who live with fear because of someone else's feud. But there is also a growing recognition that the city no longer wants to be defined by headlines about blade attacks and murder rates. In the end, the story of how Glasgow's razor gangs became feared across the United Kingdom is not just a story of violence. It is a story of overcrowded slums and mass unemployment, of religious prejudice and political opportunism, of young men searching for purpose in the wrong places, and of authorities who were slow to understand the scale of the problem they faced. It is also increasingly a story of resistance to that legacy. From police chiefs who refused to treat the gangs as untouchable, to doctors who pieced faces back together, to mothers who stood in courtrooms and demanded that someone else's son make a different choice. For viewers hearing this history today, the temptation is to treat it as something fixed in the past, a grim chapter that can be closed and filed away. But Glasgow's experience is less a closed book and more a warning label for every other city wrestling with inequality, identity, and violence. The city shows how quickly razor gangs can grow out of poverty and resentment, how deep the scars, physical and social, can run, and how long it takes to untangle that damage once it has been allowed to spread unchecked. Whether Glasgow fully escapes that reputation in the decades to come will depend on whether that resistance proves stronger than the pull of the old codes. For now, the city stands at a point where its past and present collide. A place once infamous for razor gangs and Glasgow smiles, now trying to write a new chapter in which fear is no longer its most famous export. And as long as the lessons of those scars are remembered, there is at least a chance that future generations will talk about Glasgow for reasons that have nothing to do with the blade. That's it for today, and before you go, make sure to drop a like and subscribe to our channel. And as always, share your thoughts in the comments section down below. See you in the next one.